The global Chokepoint War: How Maritime Bottlenecks Control the World Economy. The modern world flatters itself with the illusion of boundless connectivity. Satellite circles the Earth, digital networks promise instant transmission, and political rhetoric insists that globalization has dissolved distance. Yet the physical reality beneath that illusion is brutally simple. The global economy is not a fluid, decentralized organism. It is a constrained system dependent on narrow arteries through which the majority of trade must pass. These arteries, maritime choke points, are not abstractions. They are fixed geographic corridors, often only a few kilometers wide, where the movement of energy, food, and manufacturing goods, as well as strategic materials, is compressed into predictable routes. Whoever controls, disrupts, or influences these routes doesn't merely participate in global trade, they shape its outcomes. This is a structural truth most analysts avoid because it is inconvenient. It strips away the comforting narrative of free markets and replaces it with harder logic. Control over bottleneck is control over systems. In economic terms, these choke points function as constraints in the global optimization problem. When a constraint tightens, costs propagate through the entire system. When it breaks, the system reorganizes under stress. In strategic terms, these choke points are leverage nodes. They allow states, non-state actors, and even accidents to exert disproportionate influence over global outcomes. The world economy, all for its scale and complexity, remains hostage to geography. To understand power in the modern era, one must abandon surface level analysis, elections, speeches, short term crises, and instead examine the infrastructure of movement. Trade is not just an exchange of goods, it is a flow constrained by terrain, technology, and political control. The sea, covering over 70% of the Earth's surface, is the primary medium of this flow. But even the sea isn't open, it is structured by narrow passages that concentrate risk. These passages are not interchangeable, they are not easily bypassed, they are choke points, they define the limits of global commerce. Considering the scale of dependency, roughly 90% of global trade volume moves through sea. Within that, a significant proportion is funneled through a handful of critical choke points. Oil from Persian Gulf doesn't disperse randomly across the ocean, it exists through specific straits. Manufactured goods from the East Asian corridor do not scatter across infinite routes. They converge through predictable corridors towards Europe and North America. Grain exports from the Black Sea do not magically appear in global markets. They pass through narrow maritime exits each time. These flows is geographically constrained and therefore strategically vulnerable. The first choke point that demands attention is the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow passage between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea is the single most critical artery for global energy flows. A significant share of the world's oil exports passes through this corridor daily. The width of the navigable channel is limited, but the surrounding geography places it within range of coastal states, particularly Iran. This creates a structural asymmetry. A relatively modest military capability, mines, fast attack craft, anti-ship missiles, can threaten a disproportionate volume of global energy supply. The result is not just a regional concern but a global risk premium embedded in oil prices. The strategic significance of the Strait of Hormuz is not hypothetical. It is continuously priced into global markets. Insurance rates for tankers, naval deployments by major powers, and diplomatic tensions all reflect the understanding that disruption here would have immediate and severe consequences. The world doesn't have a scalable substitute for this route. Alternative pipelines exist, but they cannot fully replace maritime transport. This means the choke point is not just important, it is structurally indispensable. Control over it is not absolute. No single actor can fully dominate it. The ability to threaten it is itself a form of power. Moving eastward, the Strait of Malacca presents a different but equally critical dynamic. This corridor, running between the Malay Peninsula and the Indonesian island of Sumatra, is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. It serves as the primary route connecting the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea and, by extension, the manufacturing hubs of East Asia with global markets. For countries like China, Japan, South Korea, the strait is a lifeline. It carries not only energy imports but also the exports that sustain their economies. Vulnerability of the Strait of Malacca lies in its concentration of traffic and its limited alternatives. Ships can theoretically reroute through the Lombok of Sunda Straits, but these routes are longer, deeper, and less efficient. In economic terms, rerouting increases transportation costs and delays delivery times, introduces uncertainty into supply chains. In strategic terms, this creates what is often referred to as the Malacca dilemma. Particularly for China, a significant proportion of its energy imports passes through a corridor that it doesn't control and cannot easily secure unilaterally. This dependence shapes its naval strategy, its investments in alternative routes, and its broader geopolitical behavior. The Suez Canal represents a different category of choke point, an artificial corridor engineered to compress distance by linking the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. It provides the shortest maritime route between Europe and Asia. The economic logic is straightforward. Without the canal, ships must travel around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa, adding a significant time and cost. The canal therefore functions as a multiplier of efficiency. It reduces transit times, lowers fuel consumption, enables tighter supply chains synchronization. However, this efficiency comes at the cost of concentration. The canal is narrow, linear, and highly susceptible to disruption. The blockage of this canal by a single large container ship demonstrated how fragile this system can be. For several days, global trade was effectively bottlenecked, with hundreds of vessels delayed and supply chains disrupted across continents. The incident was not a war, not a deliberate action of sabotage, but a logistical accident, yet its impact was global. This illustrates a key point. Choke points amplify not intentional disruption but also random events. The system is efficient, but it is not resilient. The Panama Canal plays a similar role in connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. It enables ships to avoid the long and hazardous journey around South America, significantly reducing transit times for trade between the eastern and western hemispheres. Like the Suez Canal, it is an engineered solution to geographic constraints, but it introduces its own vulnerabilities. The canal relies on a system of locks and freshwater reservoirs, making it sensitive to environmental conditions. Droughts, which reduce water levels, can limit the number of ships that can bypass through, effectively constraining capacity. This environmental dependency introduces a new dimension onto the concept of choke points. It is not only military or political factions that can disrupt these corridors. Climate variability can also impose constraints. Reduced capacity in the Panama Canal doesn't shut down trade, it forces adjustments. Ships may be delayed, rerouted, or forced to carry less cargo. These adjustments propagate through supply chains, affecting prices, inventories, and production schedules. The choke point becomes a site where environmental and economic systems intersect. The Bab el-Mandeb Strait, located between the Horn of Africa and the African Peninsula, serves as the southern gateway to the Red Sea and by extension the Suez Canal. Its strategic significance lies in its position within a chain of choke points. Disruption here affects not only regional trade but also the flow of goods between Europe and Asia. The surrounding region is characterized by political instability, conflict, limited state control, increasing the risk of disruption from non-state actors. The vulnerability of Bab al-Mandeb is not theoretical. Attacks on shipping, whether through missiles, drones, or piracy, have periodically disrupted traffic. Each incident triggers a response: increased naval patrols, higher insurance costs, and in some cases, rerouting of ships. These responses are costly. They reduce efficiency and increase uncertainty. The choke point thus becomes a site of ongoing contestation where the cost of security is continuously negotiated. Further north, the Turkish Straits, the Bosporus, and the Dardanelles, connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. These narrow passages are critical for the export of grain, energy, and other commodities from countries bordering the Black Sea. Their importance becomes particularly evident during periods of conflict. Restrictions on access, whether due to war or political decisions, can disrupt global markets, particularly for food. The strategic control of the Turkish Strait is codified in international agreements, but the underlying reality remains: they are narrow, constrained, and politically sensitive. Their status can influence global commodity flows, affecting prices and availability far beyond the region. The choke point is not just a physical corridor, it is a legal, political construct, subject to interpretation and enforcement. Finally, the Cape of Good Hope represents a different kind of choke point, not a narrow passage, but a fallback route. While other choke points are disrupted, ships rerouted around the southern tip of Africa. This route is longer, more expensive, and less efficient. It serves as a pressure valve for the system, absorbing excess demand when primary routes are constrained. But it comes at a cost. Longer transit time increases fuel consumption, tie up shipping capacity, and delay deliveries. The existence of this fallback route doesn't eliminate the importance of primary choke point, it reinforces it. The cost differential between the primary routes and the fallback routes defines the economic value of the choke points. When the primary routes are open, the system operates efficiently. When they're disrupted, the system shifts to a lesser efficient equilibrium. This shift is not neutral. It redistributes it redistributes cost across the global economy. Understanding these choke points require moving beyond geography to consider their economic and strategic implications. At the first order, disruption increases transportation costs and delays deliveries. These effects are measurable and immediate. At the second order, these disruptions propagate through supply chains. Manufacturer delays in receiving inputs, retailers face shortages, and consumers face higher prices. Inflationary pressure can emerge not from monetary policy but from logistical constraints. At the third order, the implication becomes strategic. States adjust their policies to mitigate vulnerability. They invest in alternative routes, diversify supply sources, and build strategic reserves. They deploy naval forces to secure critical corridors and form alliances to share the burden of protection. These reactions are not reactive, they are anticipatory. They reflect an understanding that choke points are not temporary anomalies but permanent features of global system. The concept of choke point also challenges conventional narrative of globalization. It reveals that the system is not decentralized as it appears. Instead, it is highly concentrated, with a small number of critical nodes exerting disproportionate influence. This concentration creates both efficiency and vulnerability. It allows for economies to scale and reduce costs, but it also introduces systematic risk. The system is optimized for normal conditions, not for disruptions. This, optimizer, this optimization is a deliberate choice. The global economy has prioritized efficiency over resilience. Just in time production, lean inventories, and optimized routing all depend on the assumption that flows will remain uninterrupted. Choke points are the hidden variables in these equations. When they function normally, the system appears stable. When they are disrupted, the fragility becomes evident. From a strategic perspective, choke points are not just vulnerabilities, they are opportunities. Actors can leverage them to exert influence without engaging in direct confrontation. The threat of disruption can be as powerful as actual disruption. It can deter actions, shape negotiations, and influence outcomes. This is the logic of asymmetric power. Control is not always about ownership, it is about the ability to impose costs. The militarization of choke points reflects this logic. Naval forces are deployed not only to protect trade but to signal capability and intent. The presence of warships in critical corridors is a visible reminder that these routes are contested spaces. They are not neutral corridors, is a visible reminder. They are not neutral highways, but strategic arenas where power is projected, contested. The cost of maintaining this presence is significant, but the cost of losing control is higher. At the same time, non-state actors have demonstrated the ability to exploit choke points. Piracy, terrorism, and irregular warfare can disrupt shipping with relatively low investment. These actions do not need to be sustained to be effective. Even sporadic attacks can increase risk perceptions, raise insurance costs, and force changes in routing. The choke point amplifies the implications of these actions, turning localized incidents into global disruptions. The future of choke points will be shaped by technological, environmental, and geopolitical factors. Advances in shipping technologies may increase capacity and efficiency, but they do not eliminate geographic constraints. Climate change may alter the viability of certain routes, particularly in polar regions, but it will also introduce new risks. Geopolitical competition will continue to focus on these critical corridors as states seek to secure interests and limit their vulnerabilities. In this context, the idea of alternative routes becomes strategically significant. Initiatives to develop overland corridors such as rail and pipeline networks are often framed as economic projects, but they also serve a strategic purpose, reducing dependency on maritime choke points. These alternatives are not perfect substitutes. They have their own constraints and vulnerabilities, but they provide options, and in a constrained system, options are a form of power. The Arctic, for example, is often discussed as a potential new frontier for shipping. As ice coverage decreases, new routes may become viable, reducing transit times between Asia and Europe. However, these routes are seasonal, environmentally sensitive, and politically contested. They do not replace existing choke points, they complicate them. The fundamental logic of constrained corridors remain. Ultimately, the study of maritime choke points is a study of power in its most concrete form. It is not about ideology or rhetoric, it is about control over movement, over flow, over the physical infrastructure that sustains the global economy. The control is not absolute, it is negotiated, contested, and constantly evolving, but it is real and it has consequences. To ignore choke points is to misunderstand the structure of the global system. To understand them is to see the underlying mechanics of power. The world is not governed solely by laws, institutions, or markets. It is governed by geography, by the narrow passages through which the majority of trade must pass. These passengers are the pressure points of the system. They are where efficiency meets vulnerability, where local actions have global consequences. In the end, the global economy is not just an abstract network but a physical system. It depends on ships moving through water, on routes constrained by land, on corridors that cannot be widened indefinitely. These constraints are not weaknesses to be eliminated, they are realities to be managed. They define the limits of how and what is possible and the risk that can go wrong. The risk of what can go wrong. The global choke point, war, is not a single conflict. It is an ongoing condition, a structural feature of the world economy. It is fought not only with weapons but with policies, investments, and strategies. It is fought in boardrooms, naval commands, and diplomatic negotiations. It is fought over control, over access, and over influence. And it will continue because the geography doesn't change. The strait remains narrow, the canals remain constrained, the routes remain concentrated. The world may evolve, but its dependency on these choke points persists. The mechanics of control, why choke points exist and persists. The existence of choke points is not an accident of geography alone. It is the result of a deeper structural constraint embedded in global trade. Efficiency always converges towards compression. When markets optimize for cost, time, reliability, they eliminate redundancy. Multiple routes collapse into fewer dominant pathways because those pathways minimize distances, fuel consumption, and coordination complexity. Over time, this optimization creates dependency. What begins as efficiency becomes entrapment. This is the first failure most analysts make. They treat choke points as vulnerabilities to be avoided rather than outcomes of rational optimization. The global economy didn't stumble in these constraints, it engineered itself into them. Every decision to shorten a route, to centralize logistics, to streamline shipping lanes contributed to a system where a handful of corridors carried disproportionate weight. This is not a flaw, it is the price of efficiency. But efficiency has a hidden cost. It eliminates slack. In a system where slack, disruptions can be absorbed. In a system without slack, disruptions propagate. Maritime choke points represent the points where slack has been systematically removed. There are no parallel channels with equal capacity. There are no interchangeable routes that can absorb the same volume without cost escalation. When a choke point tightens, the system doesn't adapt smoothly, it reacts violently. This is why choke points persist despite their risk, and eliminating them would require sacrificing efficiency at a global scale. It would mean building redundant infrastructure, maintaining underutilized routes, and accepting higher baseline costs. No rational actor in a competitive system chooses this voluntarily. Instead, the system accepts the risk and relies on stability. As long as disruptions are rare, the efficiency gains outweigh the occasional shock, but this is probabilistic gamble, not a guarantee. The illusion of diversification, why alternatives fail at scale. You will often hear claims that the global system has diversified routes or reduced dependency on specific choke points. This is technically correct and strategically misleading. Diversification exists, but it is constrained by scale, cost, and geography. Take pipelines as an alternative to maritime oil transport. Pipelines can bypass certain choke points, reducing dependency on maritime routes, but they are fixed infrastructure, limited in capacity, and politically sensitive. They require long-term investments, cross-border cooperation, and protection from sabotage. More importantly, they cannot match the flexibility of shipping. A tanker can change its destination mid-route, a pipeline cannot. This rigidity limits their role as substitutes. Rail and road networks often another form of diversification. Initiatives like transcontinental rail corridors aim to connect Asia and Europe overland. These routes can carry high-value goods, reduce transit times, and bypass maritime choke points. But they face constraints of capacity, cost, and security. Rail networks cannot handle the same volume as maritime shipping. They are also vulnerable to geopolitical tensions along their routes. As a result, they complement rather than replace maritime trade. Even within maritime security systems, alternative routes are not equivalent. The Lombok and Sunda Straits can bypass the Strait of Malacca, but they are longer and less efficient. The Cape of Good Hope can replace the Suez Canal, but at a significant cost. These alternatives are not redundant systems waiting to be activated. They are degraded options that impose penalties. The existence of alternative doesn't eliminate choke point risks, it defines the cost of disruption. This leads to a critical insight. Diversification reduces vulnerability at the margin, but it doesn't eliminate structural dependency. The system remains anchored to its primary routes because these routes are optimal. When disruptions occur, the system shifts to suboptimal conditions. The resulting inefficiencies are prices of resilience. Economic transmission from narrow strait to global inflation. The impact of choke point disruption is not confined to shipping lanes, it transmits through the entire economic system. To understand this, one must trace the chain of casualty from physical constraint to macroeconomic outcome. At the first level, disruption increases transportation costs. Ships are delayed, rerouted, or forced to operate under higher risk conditions. Insurance premiums rise to reflect increased uncertainty. Fuel consumption increases as ships take longer routes. These costs are immediate and measurable. At the second level, these increased costs affect supply chains. Manufacturers rely on just-in-time delivery, face delays in receiving inputs. Inventories deplete, production slows, and output declines. Retailers experience shortage, particularly for goods with high turnover rates. The system begins to experience friction. At the third level, this disruption manifests as price increases. High transportation costs are passed on to producers and consumers. Reduced supply leads to higher prices for affected goods. Inflation emerges not from monetary expansion, but from logistical constraint. This is a form of supply-side inflation driven by physical limitations rather than financial policy. The critical point here is that choke points act as amplifiers. A localized disruption, whether a blockage, an attack, or a policy decision, can propagate globally because the system is tightly coupled. The more optimized the system, the more sensitive it becomes to shocks. This is the paradox of globalization. Integration increases efficiency, but it also increases vulnerability. Strategic behavior, how states respond to choke point dependency. States are not passive observers to these dynamics. They actively shape their policies in response to choke point dependency. This behavior can be understood through three primary strategies: protection, bypass, and control. Protection involves securing existing routes. This is achieved through naval deployments, alliances, and diplomatic agreements. Major powers maintain a presence in critical corridors to ensure the free flow of trade. This presence is not purely defensive, it is also a demonstration of capability. It signals to potential disruptors that interference will be met with force. Bypass involves developing alternative routes. This includes investment in pipelines, rail networks, and new maritime corridors. The goal is not to eliminate dependency entirely, but to reduce it. By creating options, states increase their resilience. They can shift flows in response to disruptions, mitigating the impact. Control involves exerting influence over the choke points themselves. They can be achieved through territorial claim, political influence, or direct ownership of infrastructure. Control doesn't need to be absolute to be effective. Partial control or even the ability to disrupt can provide leverage. It allows states to shape the behavior of others by manipulating access. These strategies are not mutually exclusive. States often pursue all three simultaneously. They must protect existing routes, develop alternative, and risk influence over critical nodes. This multi-layered approach reflects the complexity of the system. There is no single solution to choke point vulnerability. They are only trade-offs. The militarization of trading routes from commerce to conflict. As choke points become more strategically significant, they also become more militarized. Trading routes are no longer neutral spaces, they are contested zones where power is projected and defended. Naval forces play a central role in this process. They are tasked with securing shipping lanes, deterring potential disruptors, and responding to incidents. The presence of naval assets in choke point is both practical necessity and strategic signal. It demonstrates commitment to maintaining access and readiness to enforce it. However, militarization also introduces risk. The concentration of military assets in narrow corridors increases the potential for escalation. Miscalculations, accidents, or deliberate provocation can trigger conflicts with broader implications. The choke point becomes not only a site of economic activity but a potential flashpoint for military confrontation. Non-state actors further complicate this landscape. Groups with limited resources can exploit choke points to achieve disproportionate impact. By targeting shipping, they can disrupt trade, increase cost, and attract global attention. The choke point amplifies their actions, turning localized attacks into global events. Systemic fragility, why the global economy cannot escape choke points. The final layer of this analysis is systematic. The global economy cannot simply redesign itself to eliminate choke points. The constraints are too deeply embedded in geography and economics. Shipping remains the most efficient method of transporting large volume of goods. Air transport is faster but prohibitively expensive for bulk commodities. Overland routes are limited by terrain and capacity. Maritime routes, despite their invulnerabilities, offer unmatched efficiency. This ensures that choke points will remain central to global trade. Technological advancements can improve efficiency and reduce risk, but they will not eliminate constraints. Larger ships increase capacity but require deeper channels and more precise navigation. Automations may reduce human error but cannot prevent environmental disruptions. The system can evolve, but it cannot escape its physical limitations. This leads to a stark conclusion. Choke points are permanent feature of the global economy. They are temporary inefficiencies to be corrected. They are structural realities to be managed. Closing position. Choke points are not just geographic features, they are economic amplifiers, strategic leverage points, military flashpoints, and systematic constraints. The abstract discussion of choke points become materially significant only when examined through concrete disruptions. Systems are best understood when under stress. Stability conceals structural weaknesses. Disruptions exposes them. When choke points fail, whether through accidents, conflict, or environmental constraint, the global system doesn't collapse immediately. Instead, it reveals its internal logic, how costs propagate, how actors respond, how power is redistributed. One of the clearest demonstrations occurred during the blockage of the Suez Canal by the container vessel ever given. A single ship grounded diagonally across a narrow, artificial waterway halted a significant percentage of global trade for nearly a week. The mechanics of the event were simple. The implications were not. Hundreds of vessels accumulated at both ends of the canal, each carrying cargo tied to production schedules, contractual obligations, and downstream consumptions. The immediate effect was delay, but delay is not neutral. In tightly optimized supply chains, the time is a variable that interacts with inventory levels, financial costs, and contractual penalties. Manufacturers await inputs face uncertainty in production timelines. Retailers dependent on scheduled deliveries face potential stockouts. Energy shipments, including liquefied natural gas and refined products, experience rerouting pressures. The system absorbed the shock, but not without cost. More importantly, this incident demonstrated the asymmetry of choke points. The global system, spanning continents and involving thousands of firms, are constrained by a single physical corridor. This is not inefficiency, it is concentration. The canal reduces transit time by thousands of kilometers under normal conditions. The cost savings justify the risk, but when the risk materializes, the consequences are global. Another case reveals a different dimension: persistent low-intensity disruption. The Bab al-Mandeb Strait has been subject to periodic attacks and instability due to conflict in Yemen. Unlike the Suez blockage, which, which was a discrete event, disruption in this region are intermittent and ongoing. This reflects not a sudden halt, but a continuous increase in the risk. Shipping companies respond by adjusting behavior. Some reroute vessels to avoid that area altogether, increasing transit times. Others continue to use the route but incur higher insurance premium. Naval escorts may be deployed, adding operational complexity. Each of these responses carries a cost. These costs accumulate over time, affecting freight rates, commodity prices, and ultimately consumer markets. The key insight from this case is that disruption doesn't need to be total to be effective. Partial, intermittent interference can achieve similar outcomes by increasing uncertainty. Markets price uncertainty aggressively. The choke point amplifies this effect because there are limited alternatives. Even a small probability of disruption can lead to significant adjustments in behavior. A third case involves environmental constraints rather than conflict. The Panama Canal has experienced reduced capacity due to drought conditions affecting its freshwater reservoirs. The canal's operation depends on a system of locks that require large volumes of water. When water level falls, the number of ships that can transit is limited. The impact of this constraint is not dramatic as a complete blockage, but it is economically significant. Shipping schedules are adjusted, transit slots become scarce, and priority is given to higher value cargo. Lower value shipments may be delayed or rerouted. This result is a relocation of capacity based on economic value rather than pure logistical considerations. This introduces a subtle but important dynamic. Choke points do not only constrain volume, they also influence allocation. When capacity is limited, decisions may be made about which goods move and which are delayed. These decisions are influenced by the market prices, contractual obligations, and strategic priorities. The choke point becomes a mechanism through which economic hierarchies are enforced.